chapter 21. Neil's going to do the first part, and then I'll do the latter part here.
Wade's having me go first. Hello. There we go. Wade's having me go first so he can clean up all the messes that I create here. So I want to start off telling you a story about courage. Many years ago, there were a group of people from our community at the Revolution who went to Turin, Italy, to spend 6 weeks. And we went there to help some new missionaries who were getting a church started at a university there in the city. And my wife, is this not on? Oh, children. Go to children's church. K through second grade. There we go. You kids thought you were going to have to listen to me this whole time. Good for you. Any of you guys need to go to children's church up there? Raj? Feels dangerous right here. Right within range of a spitball or something like that. What was I saying? Oh, we went to Italy. And my wife and 3 really young kids at the time, little Wesley right there. He was a teeny little baby at that time. And we were staying with the pastor and his wife, Frank and Pam. And they had an apartment there. And as we were just kind of getting settled in and learning about the city, on the 3rd day we were there, I heard a knock on the door. And Frank and Pam had left to run some errands, and so my wife and the kids were taking a nap. And I thought, well, better answer the door. So I walked to the door, and there was this short, bald-headed man standing there, and he began speaking and talking a million miles a minute. And of course, I was trying to explain to him that I didn't speak Italian, so I didn't understand anything he was saying. And the more he was talking, the more agitated he became, and was becoming very angry. And I heard him say the name Concetta, which was the name of a girl who Frank and Pam had met at the university, and they had invited her to come live with them. She was 19 years old, and she was a full-time student, but she had been living under a bridge because she had left her home because her father was abusive. And Frank and Pam had invited her into their home and said she could stay there. And through kind of all the anger and whatever was going on, I figured this must be Conchetta's father. And he was so angry, and he actually like pushed past me and walked into the apartment. And he was yelling and kind of making a scene. And I began to become fearful for my wife and my kids who were back in one of the bedrooms. And I thought, I got to get this guy out of here. And so I started yelling at him, in English, of course. And we had taken a tour of the city the day before, and I saw on the police cars, the word Polizia was written on them. And so I started yelling, Polizia, Polizia, and I started pointing to the telephone, like I'm going to call the police, because I don't, of course, know the number, nor do I know how to speak Italian. But I was yelling, getting real agitated. And at one point, we were standing face to face, more like face to face. And I thought, I'm about to throw down on a mission trip. I finally got him to leave. I think I scared him. I started acting really crazy and yelling and getting all red in the face and kind of pushed him out the door, shut the door. And I look out the window, and he's standing outside the building. He's kind of like pacing back and forth, and he's got his fist clenched. It looks like he's ready to really hurt somebody. I called Frank. I said, dude showed up. I don't know who it was. It might have been Conchetta's father. What should I do? He said, I'll come home. So they came back, and I was kind of watching outside the window, and I saw Frank walk up. And Frank is this like a pudgy, short, round, mushy guy. And gentle. As gentle as a feather. And so I see him kind of walk up to this guy, and this guy's like, his arms are going, he's going crazy, and Frank is just kind of patiently standing there calmly, and they're kind of talking back and forth. The guy's yelling, Frank is talking, and of course, didn't know what was going on in that conversation, and eventually this guy left, and when Frank came into the house, he told me what had happened. He said that this man had told him, it was Conchetta's father, and had said that he was going to come back here and he was going to kill everyone in the apartment, and unless he kind of told him where Conchetta was. And Frank said, your daughter has asked me not to tell you where she's at, so you can just kill all of us. Which I was like, yeah, thanks a lot, Frank. You didn't consult us on that. I'd have turned her right over. No, that's not true. That's not true. But he just kept telling him, I'm not going to let you know where she's at. And it was just amazing to see this guy who could have easily gotten pulverized by this Italian, strong, construction-looking guy, and to stand up to him at his own peril. And this, of course, was one of the first insights that we had into the love that Frank and Pam had for these students. But that, to me, when I was thinking about the word courage, that's a picture that came to mind. Courage is a word that conjures up for us probably all sorts of images, but courage is when someone who would willingly step into danger for some purpose for the sake of someone else. It's being willing to sacrifice, maybe even die for what they believe in. And when we see courage, it inspires us. Today, Wade and I are going to be sharing a story together of courage. It's a story from the book of Acts at the Revolution. As mentioned, we've been going through the book of Acts this past semester. Last week, we left off where Paul was saying goodbye to the Ephesian leaders, and he was headed off to Jerusalem. And Jeff, one of our pastors, was sharing last week, and he talked about how common it is in our day for people to think of Paul as this unfavorable character. You know, this kind of person that of all the people in the Bible, people just don't like Paul. And yet we see in this story the love that the people who knew Paul, this deep love they had for him, they were kissing him, they were hugging him, they were pleading with him not to go to Jerusalem, which was the next spot that he was headed off to. And partly because they were afraid for him, because they knew that potential being arrested, potentially dying might happen to him when he went there. And so starting off in chapter 21, he arrives in Jerusalem, and when he goes to Jerusalem, he first visits James. And James was the leader in the church in Jerusalem. James was the brother of Jesus who became a believer, it seems, at some point following the resurrection. And he is the one who, in Acts chapter 15, seems to speak on behalf of all the leaders as they're debating this idea of whether the ministry of Paul, his ministry to Gentiles, was a legitimate ministry. And Paul is again meeting with James and the leaders, and he's telling them all that God has done through the ministry of the word. Paul has traveled to all these places proclaiming the gospel, and he's telling the stories of all the things that God had done to reach many, many Gentiles and Jews alike. And in verse 20 of chapter 21, it says, when they heard this, they praised God. Well, at least most of them did. There had been some growing concern among some of the Jewish Christians that were there that Paul had a bit of an anti-Jewish bent to his ministry. They accused him of things like teaching that everyone should throw out all of the Old Testament, or assuming that Paul has rejected some of the amazing things that God had done in the history of loving and working with his people. And Paul, of course, had not turned against the Jews. In fact, whenever he entered a city, one of the first things he did was went to the temple to proclaim the message of Jesus Christ to the Jews who were there. And he himself had been a Pharisee, so these were his people, the Jewish people. Paul even took up a collection for the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. And he loved them so much, and this was a part of the reason he was returning back to Jerusalem to deliver this gift, but there was still a tension that existed between he and these Jewish Christians. So James suggests that Paul do something to smooth it over with these people. So in verse 23, it says, there are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. So these people were actually coming to the end of what is called a Nazirite vow. And this was a common vow among the Jews, and it's made for a period of time to kind of dedicate oneself to God. And during a Nazirite vow, you don't touch any alcohol, and you don't cut any hair on your head. And so James was suggesting that Paul participate with them in the purification rites, which is what happens at the very end of the vow. And then he suggests that Paul pays for them to all go to the barbershop. And that was like barbershop 1. The original barbershop one would have been. But actually, he doesn't get to do that. But Paul says, sure, I'll do it. And so the spirit of both James and Paul is the spirit of working together, to working in unity, trying not to unnecessarily offend people, and making accommodations for people who maybe are struggling with their perspective about things. They are in agreement and they work to be in peace with one another. And as Christians, as you notice, oftentimes we're often quick to draw lines between one another and to say, I believe this, you believe that, I'm a part of this group, you're a part of that group. And you've been a Christian for any length of time, surely you've noticed this and seen this. And for many of you here who are a part of the community at First Baptist, you may or may not know this, but your pastor Wade has become a good friend of mine, along with many other pastors in our community. And Wade has not just been kind and generous in offering space and those kinds of things, but he was really one of the first to invite other people to kind of be a part of what God was doing together in whatever that looked like. And he was the first to speak up about that and has been a great example to us. This is like the 3rd service that we've done together with you guys. We've never done a service with anyone that I remember other than this community here. And it's really an amazing thing for us to be able to love one another, to worship together, to serve one another. And you got a great guy here. And we've baptized like over 20 people here in this. Thank you. He's a good man. We've baptized over 20 people. He never once even asked us, what do we believe about baptism? Just like, okay, you guys want to baptize people? We want to baptize people. Well, yeah, we'll let you baptize people. And you can do it at our service if you want to. And fortunately, we have very similar views on baptism that you do. I hate to reveal this to you, Wade, like we believe some real weird things about baptism. These baptisms that are happening are actually baptisms for the dead. Hopefully you're comfortable with that. This is the expectation that God has for his leaders, that we would work toward one purpose and for unity in the faith, so that Jesus would be glorified through us. This is not about us and our individual things that we're doing, but about God and what he's doing. So Paul was trying to do this same thing. He and James kind of decided together that they would do this. He was trying to do the right thing. But of course, people are people. And that doesn't always work. So he's at the temple. He's fulfilling this vow. And some of the Jews from Asia, probably some of the people that he had just left in Ephesus, recognize him because they caused some trouble for him there. And I'm imagining maybe it's this guy, Alexander the coppersmith. And I don't know why I imagine that. I just think it's a cool name. Alexander the coppersmith. And this guy seems frightful because Paul tells Timothy, you better watch out for him because he did me much harm. And so maybe it's Alexander the coppersmith and his cronies who've come there and they begin stirring up the crowd. Alexander the coppersmith is like the Lewis or the Floyd Mayweather in religious terms. He's the guy you don't want to be standing on the opposite side of. But whoever it was, and whoever began stirring up the crowds, they don't like Paul, and they're beginning to accuse him of defiling the temple. They're not changing their minds, regardless of what they see him doing. And so in verse 28, it says, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place. They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and they assumed that Paul brought him into the temple. Isn't it ironic? Because here's Paul trying to make peace with the Jews. And in this process, they're accusing him of defiling their religion. Of course, as a trained Pharisee, Paul would have known not to bring a Gentile into the temple. But in verse 30, it says, the whole city was aroused. And the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. And they were going to stone him. Paul was as good as dead in the hands of this mob. But fortunately, a few Roman soldiers had seen what was going on earlier, and they got word to their commander, and he comes just in the nick of time to check out the situation. And in verse 32, it says, when the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. You know, there's one thing that will always get a bully to stop bullying, and that's a bigger bully. And that is, of course, what the Romans were to the Jews at this time. He tries to figure out, this commander is trying to figure out what's going on. He can't get an answer from anyone. So he takes Paul into custody, and as a result, his arrest actually ends up saving Paul's life. And in verse 35, it says, when Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. And the crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" And this, of course, should sound familiar to us. This crowd has been in this place before. Years earlier in Jerusalem, a similar mob was shouting, crucify him, to another innocent man. And Paul, in this moment, speaks up. And he asks the commander, can I say something to the people? And the commander says, aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt that led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago? And it doesn't record this, but Paul must have said, no, that's not me, somebody else. In verse 39, Paul answered, I'm a Jew and from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please, let me speak to the people. A careful observer will notice the sensitivity that Paul used as he addressed the crowd. He spoke to them in Aramaic, which kind of calmed the crowd down. And then he tells his story. And as he's telling the story, he's relating to them. I'm one of you. He addresses them as brothers and fathers, and he recounts his conversation on the road to Damascus. And as he's telling the story, he's connecting his story with God's story and what God's story has been with the Jews. And he says, God, the God of this temple spoke to me. And yet, I was the one who was destroying Christians. I was the one who had approved of Jesus' death. And maybe they're thinking, okay, yes, maybe not such a bad guy after all. He's defended our Jewish faith. He's defended our heritage. He's even killed some of these Christ followers. Until he said this. In verse 21 of chapter 22, he said, then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And the crowds came unhinged. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He is not fit to live. It was one thing for a Gentile to convert to Judaism, but quite another thing for a Gentile to find salvation and peace with God through some other means. And this idea of salvation through Jesus, this was not just extended to those Jewish people, but it was also extended to the Gentiles. And this became the spark and the fire and the bomb that was ignited in that moment. They had rid the world of Jesus, or at least they thought they had. And now his followers, they're taking over even our Pharisees, and they're proclaiming salvation through Jesus Christ to the world. To be honest, I think we're just a little bit too insulated from these kinds of experiences as Americans. A disapproving glance, or a passing comment, or maybe someone choosing not to be our friend because we're a Christian. This is what we might experience as persecution here. Yet if we step outside of our culture into the greater world around us, it's a much different story. For a Muslim, converting to Christ and proclaiming Jesus as Savior can be a death sentence in some countries, even in 2016. That's betrayal. That's blasphemy. That person, they would say, is not fit to live. The Romans end up being the ones who step in and save Paul's life. They don't understand why everyone's so upset. These Jewish people are always getting worked up about something that we don't really understand. And so the commander said, let's just beat him until he tells us why everyone's so upset. The word that's used here is actually the word flogged, which is the same word that was used for Jesus' flogging. F.F. Bruce says, the scourge was a fearful instrument of torture, consisting of leather thongs weighted with rough pieces of metal or bone and attached to a stout wooden handle. If a man did not actually die under the scourge, which he frequently did, he would certainly be crippled for life. And this was about to happen to Paul. So he stretched out to be flogged, and at the last moment, at the 11th hour, Paul, maybe he was planning on doing this all along, pulls out the Roman citizen card. And in verse 25, he says, as they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion, is it illegal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't been found guilty? I can't remember or not. And this changed everything. In verse 29, it says, those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Oh, no. Remember, the only thing that can stop a bully, usually, is a bigger bully. And the commander was now afraid for his life because of his superiors. What if his commander found out that he was about to flog a Roman citizen and he came a hair's breadth from doing so? Even the fact that he had put Paul in chains would have warranted some punishment to him. And in fear, they decided to back off. I thought he was just another Jew, not a Roman citizen. Wade is going to kind of finish the rest of the story for us and wrap this up.
I'm a little embarrassed because I don't have all these nice things to say about Neil. So, not that there aren't nice things to say. I just didn't prepare them. So continuing on with the story this morning, the commander doesn't understand what's going on here. So he tried to ask the crowd what's going on. He gets mixed responses from the crowd. He thought he would beat Paul, but Paul's citizenship kept him from doing this. So he figured he would take him to the religious leaders, to the Jewish leaders. Maybe there would be an answer there. So we have Paul standing in front of the Jewish leaders, just like Jesus standing in front of the Jewish leaders, just like Stephen standing in front of the high priest. We have Paul in chapter 23, verse 1. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I fulfill my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." So Paul, even standing before the religious leaders, he's proclaiming, look, I'm innocent, okay? I am with you. I'm a part of what God is doing. And the high priest hears Paul say this, and he says, look, I want you to strike him. Look at verse 2. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Now, when the high priest, or when they strike Paul loses it. He begins to insult the high priest, but he doesn't know it's the high priest. Look here, and if you're looking in the scripture here, he says, I didn't realize it was the high priest. Now, you might remember some people say that Paul had impaired vision. Maybe Paul really couldn't recognize the high priest. But when Paul's called out on it, Paul apologizes. And then, if you read closely here in the text, I won't read all of it for you this morning, you'll see that Paul brings up an issue. I mean, Paul is right on in terms of knowing what to do here. You might remember the religious leaders are divided into two groups. One of the groups is the Pharisees, and the other group, the Sadducees. And the Pharisees had a belief system. They believed in angels, they believed in spirits, they believed in the resurrection from the dead, and the Sadducees denied the fact that people were resurrected at the end of time. They denied angels. They denied spirits. So Paul, again, pretty smart here. Look what he says in verse 6. My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from the Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. Paul must know what he's doing here, right? He knows he's saying something that half the group is not going to agree with here. And look at what it says in verse 10. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. Don't you love that? Paul's standing there on trial, and he has a way to say something that's going to turn the group against itself. But again, Paul is in danger here. He ordered the troops to go down, this is the Roman commander here, and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So Paul is almost killed in this confrontation with the Jewish leaders here. Look at verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Isn't this a cool story? I mean, Paul's in the middle of all of this confusion here, and yet God is saying, "I'm with you." Paul has courageously traveled to Jerusalem against all advice. He's gone into a dangerous place, and God is standing there telling him, "I am going to be with you." In all the confusion, God's there. In all the uncertainty, God's there. And Luke wants us to know as he writes the book of Acts that Paul was assured of God's presence at this time. And Paul's thankful that he's faithful. Paul's thankful for where he is, and God is with him there. A few years ago, we were in Atlanta. My wife's family lives in Atlanta, and my wife is going to go shopping with her parents. Now, when my wife goes shopping with her parents, I usually opt out of those trips. And so I took the kids to downtown Atlanta, and we thought we'd walk around a little while. We went to the Varsity and had a good, wholesome meal at the Varsity in Atlanta. I said that sarcastically if you don't know what the Varsity is. And then we walked down to the Martin Luther King Jr. historic site there at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and they've got a museum there. And as we were walking through the exhibits, one of the exhibits caught my attention. It was a sermon playing on a videotape reel that Martin Luther King Jr. had preached just weeks before his assassination. Now, as a good preacher, I always like hearing a good sermon, but it struck me because the words that he was saying in that sermon in some ways predicted his death. And at his funeral, weeks later, they would play this sermon. I want to read this sermon to you, or part of this sermon to you this morning. This is what Martin Luther King Jr. said on February the 4th, 1968. He said, "Every now and then, I think about my own death. And I think about my own funeral, not in a morbid sense. Every now and then," he said, "I ask myself, what is it that I would want said? And I leave the word to you this morning. If any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. Every now and then I wonder what I want them to say. Tell them that not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize, because that's not important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards, because that's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want somebody to say on that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that day that I tried to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who are in prison. I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. That I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have much money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. But I just want to leave a committed life behind. And that's all I want to say. And as a pastor, I love a good sermon. And he was a great preacher, no doubt. But as I read those words, I thought about what he must have known about the journey that he was embarking on. He must have known the danger. And in many ways, he's much like Paul, isn't he? Paul went to Jerusalem in our story today, and he knew that his life was in danger. Now, God saved his life at this particular juncture, but we know eventually Paul is going to give his life because of his message. He's going to give his life the same way that Jesus, not in the same way that Jesus gave his life for us, but he's going to give his life as an extension of his faith in Christ. Let's keep reading here in verse 12 chapter 23, verse 12, the next morning some Jews found a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath to not eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. I mean, these guys are serious about ending Paul's life, aren't they? They're taking a vow here to make sure that this guy is dead. But in verse 16, when the son of Paul's sister heard this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. So his nephew finds out, he tells Paul, and the Roman government works to get Paul out of town. Look at verse 23. He called 2 of the centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. When? At 9 o'clock at night, at a secret time, in the dark. They deliver Paul. It says, provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. So here's Paul being protected by the Roman army. They don't know what they're doing, right? They think that they are carrying out justice, but in many ways, God is using the Roman government to proclaim the message that Paul is going, the message that Jesus has died for the sins of the world, the message that Jesus has fulfilled the Old Testament story of God. Paul is delivering that, and he will deliver that. Now, you have to ask the question, don't you? How many of you wonder when you read this, did the guy starve that made the vow? You thinking that? Actually, rabbinic law says that when a vow becomes impossible to fulfill, that the person is released from the vow. So these guys probably didn't die. But that ends the story today, and we kind of close there with that story. And we think about, well, what does this mean for us? I mean, in 2016, you might read this story, and you might think, well, that's a really cool story. And from a historical perspective, it's kind of neat to see how the early church worked out, how Paul was on these missionary journeys, and how he's going into this, back into Jerusalem and enters this dangerous experience. And on one hand, you might go, that's a really cool story. But again, I don't want to stop there, because their story is also our story, isn't it? And in many ways, you and I are called, maybe not in the same exact way that Paul is called, to risk our very lives for the gospel. But at the same time, God has called each and every one of us, in whatever place in life He's called us toward, to be faithful, hasn't He? Sometimes that involves risk. Sometimes that involves stepping out into the unknown. Sometimes that involves maybe not being praised for what we do, right? It takes courage. As Neil opened up with a story of courage this morning, we're reminded that we are called to be courageous in the world in which we live. We're challenged by Paul, aren't we? His life challenges us. I mean, think about the singular focus of his life, to proclaim the message of Jesus everywhere he went. He stood before governors. He stood before the high priest of the Jewish faith. He stood in some very scary places. And again, in that day and time, I mean, you say the wrong thing, right? You're going to get stoned to death. But Paul was courageous nonetheless. And so as we think about Paul this morning, may we be challenged to have the same sort of courage. May we be challenged to be faithful, to speak out when God tells us to speak out. So this morning, I want to challenge each of us with this story. May we be reminded that we serve a God who calls us to speak out, a God who calls us to action at times. And may we be challenged to respond in whatever way God is prompting you. What we're going to do this morning is we're going to invite those who are going to be baptized to come out and share their name and to talk just a little bit, just to tell why they're being baptized this morning. And then we're going to give them a chance to go back and change clothes. And while they're changing clothes, we're going to sing a song together. And during that song, you're going to be invited to respond if there's a way that you'd like to respond this morning. We usually take some time in our service just to respond. The altar's open. Maybe someone would want to come down and pray at the altar this morning. Maybe you'd like to pray with Neil or with me. You can come down and do that. And we're going to stand and sing that song. Then we're going to have the baptism. And then we're going to sing one more song as we close this morning. So I invite you to come now, Neil.
All right, let's have everyone who is getting baptized come on up front here. For us, much like it is here at First Baptist, is a symbol of a profession. It's a profession of faith that we make in Jesus. We baptize as a way of proclaiming what God has done in our lives. And so these people that are up here today are taking a step of courage and a step of obedience to say, God has changed me at whatever point that for them, and I'm being baptized as a way of declaring that publicly. So I'm going to hand the mic down here, and they're going to introduce themselves, and you guys can come all the way down here. In fact, just get up here on the stage so everyone can see you too.
Hi, I'm Chanel. I'm a secondary math education major, and I'm really just doing this today because I grew up in a family that wasn't a Christian family, and I've decided to live a life of Christian values, and as a Christian, I just want to proclaim that in front of everybody.
Hi everyone, my name is Ian Hagenow. I'm a junior at Ball State studying creative writing, and I'm getting baptized today because about a year ago I went through some tough times, and through those tough times I realized that all things are made possible through Jesus Christ and full and complete faith in Him, and that's why I'm here.
Hi guys, my name is Kelsey Atkins. I am a sophomore and I'm going for nursing. I'm here because I am willingly giving my life over to Christ and living by His values, so thank you.
My name is Jay Coles. I'm an English education major at Ball State. I decided to get baptized today because after not really experiencing God and His presence all my life, I went to Arizona for spring break a month or so ago, and I really got to experience like God fully, and it really encouraged me to like say to myself and out loud for the first time that I'm going to give my life to God. So yeah.
My name is Caitlin. I'm a creative writing major, and I'm here today because I began to follow Christ in December, and I wanted to make a public declaration of the change in me.
Hi, I'm Misa Arrieta. I'm an accounting major, and I'm having my public confession. This past summer, I took my faith seriously. I grew up in a nice home, and it wouldn't have been possible without my house church leader, Brandon, my dad, and a very special girl, Morgan.
Hi, my name is Diamond. I'm a biology and Spanish major. I'm a sophomore, and I'm here today basically because I want to use this as a public declaration to advance my faith and to be the child of God that He's called me to be.
My name is Spencer Evans. I'm a freshman accounting and sport administration major. I'm here today because I gave my life to Christ long ago, and I'm just ready to publicly profess that.
I'm Sarah Gillespie. I'm a freshman elementary education major, and I'm here today because earlier this year I decided to finally give my life to Christ, and I want to make that public now.
Great. You guys can all go back and get changed, and the band's going to come up and lead us in some worship, and then we'll be back out.